All right, the next one we're going to talk about is probably, arguably, one of the most brilliant people of all time. Isaac Newton. Now, Isaac Newton was born in England, lived in England. In fact, I'm not sure we have a record of him ever actually traveling off of England. I don't know that he ever even went to the European mainland. Don't quote me on that, but I don't remember that in anything I've read. But Newton lived from 1643. Remember, Galileo died in 1642. 1643 to 1727. So Newton also lived a long, full life. He lived to be almost 80 years old when he passed away. He was educated at Trinity College in Cambridge, England, and actually became a professor there by the time he was around 16 years old. He was so advanced in mathematics, the professors there said, we ought to just hire this guy. So they hired him as a professor in mathematics when he was very young. And he was a professor there. Now, strange things, strange fate occurs sometimes. One of them was this. When Newton was 22 years old, 22 to 23 years old, he was already a professor, but they closed the school that he was teaching at. They closed the school because the plague came through, the Black Plague was coming through England. And how do you keep people from dying from the Black Plague? You do the same thing we did this year when you have to isolate people. The only way to stop it is to get people away from each other, because from people to people it gets transmitted. And this is really bad. I mean, there are places where the mortality rate was 50, 60%. In some places where people were all close together, like prisons and stuff, it was like 80, 90%. So, I mean, our problems nowadays are not nearly as bad as it was back then. The Black Plague was really bad. But the way it worked, and the people that survived, were the ones that got out of the cities. And so when the Black Plague came, all the people, all the rich people in London that had country estates and places that they could go, all scattered to the country. And they spent their year or two in the country, and then the plague would die out. The people that really died were the ones that were poor, couldn't go anywhere else, were stuck living in the squalor. They couldn't go anywhere. They were the ones that got the Black Plague, and most of those died. Well, Newton, he was not from a wealthy family, but he was from what you call like an upper middle class family. He had grandparents that had an orchard farm in the country, and he went and lived with them. And so he was 22, 23 years old. He went and lived with them, but he didn't have any responsibilities. He didn't have to teach class. He didn't have to do anything. So all he would do was spend all day working on math problems, trying to figure science out. Essentially, this was like his dream come true. He was trying to figure out how the world worked, and he didn't have anything else to do. There's stories of them bringing him food, but he would be so intent on his notebooks that they would leave the food there, and he wouldn't eat for like a day. He would just sit there. They'd come back, and the food would be sitting there, and then he would crash because his body had to eventually go in, and he would sleep, and then he would eat a whole bunch. But then he would go do this, and he was doing this for like a year. But this was the most productive year in science ever. Okay? Isaac Newton, during this year, figured out his 3 laws of motion, which define how everything moves in the universe. He figured out his law of universal gravitation. He invented calculus to prove that was there. He measured the speed of sound. He also worked with light and discovered infrared radiation. I mean, that was a really good year. So Newton did all these things. Now, we think they were all done this time. Now, he did all those things, but there's some debate about whether he did them exactly that year. He did a lot of stuff in that year that got lost, and then he later reproduced it or redefined it. But he came up with the notions, the ideas that defined him that year. All right. The problem with Newton is you have to look at his personality. He never married. He didn't like women. He didn't like men either. He didn't really like anybody. He thought everybody was below him. They couldn't understand him. And that's probably true for the majority, but there were a few, really smart people out there that could understand what he was doing. And so he would do these things, but he would never tell anybody about them. It comes down to a guy named Edmund Halley. Edmund Halley was the astronomer at the Greenwich Observatory, which is just outside of London. And he was looking through records and realized that there was a bright comet that came every 76 years. And he said, or he thought to himself, hey, if there's a bright comet coming every 76 years, maybe it's the same comet. And it just keeps coming around the sun all the time. And so by then they have what they called the Royal Society, which is a bunch of learned guys that would get together in London and they would talk science and they would talk all different kinds of science. Well, Edmund Halley was there and he said, hey, I have this idea that this is the same comet. Who should I talk to? And the people said, go talk to Newton. He knows about this stuff. So Halley went to Newton and said, hey, could this work? And Newton said, yeah, under my force of gravity, universal gravitation, everything's going to go on these paths. It would work just fine. And so Halley said, well, why don't you publish this so the rest of the world knows what's happening? And he said, it's all below them, you know. Halley or Newton didn't think that it was worth it. He cared about learning it himself, but he didn't care about sharing it very much. But he was very vain, Newton was. During the last years of his life, there were like 30 or 40 portraits made of him that he commissioned to have made of him. That painted him, but they always painted him really dashing with his long flowing hair. We're not exactly sure he looked that good because he would pay them to make him look good. But, because he was kind of a vain guy. But Edmund Halley said, look, if you did this, you'd become famous. If you become famous, you could become a knight. Because he wasn't a knight. And to be a knight back then was to be part of royalty. And once you were part of royalty, you had way more privileges. You could own property, you could vote in elections, you could actually shape what was going on. If you weren't, if you were just a regular peasant, you were limited in what you could do. And you could pass that on to your relatives. Now, he didn't have any children to pass it on to. But that's why later on he became Sir Isaac Newton. And the story goes that Halley said, hey, write up all these things that you found, especially all your principles of motion and your gravitation, all that. Make a book and I will take it and get it published. So Newton went back to find it because he did this stuff back when he was 22, 23 years. He couldn't find the notes for that again. It was many years later. And so he sat down and he redid the whole thing. He redid it all in just a few months. He redid it all, made this several hundred-page book. Took it to Halley. Halley took it to the press, the publisher, and said, hey, you got to print this book. This is super important stuff. And the publisher said, no way, nobody's going to read a book about physics. We just have a book about fishes that we printed that we can't sell, and we're losing all kinds of money on it. And Halley finally said, no, you're not going to lose money at this. I'm going to pay for part of it. He didn't have a lot of money, but he convinced the Royal Society to pay for it too. So they essentially paid to have hundreds of copies of this book made. They paid for every single copy to have it printed. Once it was printed, they distributed throughout Europe, and as Halley had predicted, Newton became famous. Within a few years, he was very famous. He was one of those guys that became the one that everybody knew was brilliant. Didn't change that he was a little strange, but he was known as famous, and then he later became knighted because of that. All right, so he wrote his book, and his book was called Principia, or the Principles of Physical Motion. So the first thing we want to talk about, let's talk about his 3 laws of motion. First, he realized that all objects want to maintain their state. He got this from Galileo. In fact, Newton has a very famous quote. He says, if I have seen but a little further than others, it's because I have stood on the shoulders of giants. Meaning, he read what Galileo did and he said, I knew that was right and I just took the next step. That is the whole philosophy. Ever since Newton's time, that's been the whole philosophy of science. Is you go to school to learn everything that's been done before, and then your goal is to push the envelope one step further. Push it a little further. Second, he said, to change that inertial state, you have to apply a force, and the force you apply is equal to the mass of the object times its acceleration. Okay? So it wants to stay in whatever state it is, going at a constant velocity, and to change that you have to accelerate. And how do you accelerate? You have to apply force. So to move or change the state of anything, there has to be a force. And then he said there's always an equal and opposite force. So, if I push on the wall pushes back on me. Whenever two things contact, the force between them is always the same. I push on it, it pushes on me. Okay? There's always an equal and opposite force. From that, you can derive how all things move throughout the universe. It's just a matter of figuring out what forces act on it, and then how those forces act allows you to figure out how everything's moving. And it allows you to deduce how the universe works. Okay? So, very important stuff here. And this should be in stuff that you learned about way back in like 9th grade or something like that. However, it is so important that if you take a physics class, we spend the whole first semester working on this. Just Newton's laws of motion, what Newton figured out way back in the 1600s. All right. Then he came up with his law of gravitation. And for astronomy, since we're in an astronomy class, that's even more important to us because it's gravitation that holds the universe together. And the key was the law of universal gravitation. Now, you've probably heard the story. The story is that while he was here at his grandparents' orchard, he was outside and he saw an apple fall. Okay? Some say it fell on his head. We don't know that. I think that was made up later. But he did say he saw an apple fall. Now, again,